Welcome to a episode of Study with a Chess Buddy. We are looking at the Build Up Your Chess, the Fundamentals 1 book by Yusupov. And this time we're looking at diagram 1-2. And as last time, we want to spend some offline time basically staring at this diagram, possibly setting it up on a board, and deeply analyzing it, trying to come up with the winning line. And what I suggest is write down your lines so that you can compare to what I come up with as well. And I'm going to pause the video now and spend probably around 10 minutes. We'll see, depending on how hard the problem is. And I will come back and then share what my lines are. Okay, I'm back. Hopefully you were able to come up with something on your own as well. So for me, I really got hung up. First of all, I spent about 20 minutes on this problem, so longer than I would typically like to. I was very, very hung up on this first move. I kept thinking that queen takes e6 check was the answer. So I kept thinking everything starts, the winning line has to start with this move. I just couldn't let it go for some reason. So, the first one, for example, we'll walk through the first couple ideas I had. So king goes to f8, queen goes to f6 to check the king again, king goes to g8, and then my idea was to bring the rook involved here with the threat of doing this on the next move, right? So that was the idea. But, obviously there's ideas like this where the queen just sacks itself and the queen recaptures. So yes, white's up 4 points in material as a result, but I kept thinking, there's probably something better. Especially like if we look at the material balance of the game here after that exchange, we have a queen and 4 pawns. So, 9 plus 4 is 13 that white essentially is ahead by, and black is 5 plus 6, so 11. So basically there's a 2-point difference. White's up the exchange. Is that a compelling answer to this puzzle? And I didn't feel like it was. So if we rewind a bit here, my second line was honestly just a permutation of this. So instead of the king going to f8 as its escape, it just goes to h8, and it's honestly, it works out to be the same. So you do, check, king goes this way, check, king comes back perhaps, and then you bring the rook out again, and we're back to the same position. So that was, another idea. We'll take a look at one more before we get to my final line. Another idea I had was queen takes e6 check. And this is one where I kept getting really, I struggled more because the king could, if they go to g7, this one opened up a lot more lines. So it did make me think about getting the rook involved and providing black with an opportunity to do something because the king wasn't in check. And the strongest I could come up with at this point was, so after rook e5, I kept thinking like, well, black probably will want to involve their queen, right? So perhaps queen f8, and then, I did like rook g5 check, trying to perhaps trap the king in the corner. King goes to h7, and then I went to like rook h5. I couldn't really figure out how to coordinate my rook and queen in this scenario to end up with more material or a mate than my other calculations. But one thing I will say is that this line of thinking did eventually lead me to my final line right here. And basically, I just thought, well, what if you just start the line off with rook e5 instead of it being like, the follow-up move that I did in my last example? So this does introduce the risk of, well, okay, so there's no check, so this does give black an opportunity for a counterattack. But the only thing I could really see in terms of a classic tactic at this point was, forcing moves that are checks. You've got like queen takes, but then if the king takes, like, I mean, like, who as a human, who would play that? I didn't really see a follow up, so that didn't seem very likely. There's other, capture type moves, but it doesn't really work either because they're going to be sacrificing like a rook to try to like protect this rank. So anyhow, after this move, for my line, I think I felt what a human would likely play. So rook e5, queen f8, right? So queen goes here, and then I was like, okay, perfect time to do the rook check that we saw in the previous line. King goes to h7 because it's the only legal square. Then if the rook goes to h5 check, king has to go back to the only legal square, and then you could throw in a mate this way. And now we've got this beautiful, corner pattern where the rook covers, this direction, and the queen basically covers these, right? So that's a pretty common pattern that was nice to see in my final line, and that made me feel comfortable to say I think I've actually arrived at a legitimate solution. Now it turns out when I looked at the book afterward to see like, well, hey, did I match? The book actually doesn't have a single line for an answer. What it had was about 3 or 4 different lines that start with rook e5. So this made me curious. Well, what about if we take a look at the computer engine and see like what does Stockfish think about this, right? So helps if I actually start back at the beginning. All right. So as we can see here, the strongest line does in fact start with rook e5. So rook goes to e5, but it looks like the computer's like, hey, I'm trying to delay this as long as possible. So it actually went for the queen sack on the pawn there, and the king recaptures. So like I was like, okay, well, I don't feel bad for not calculating that because I don't feel that a human would play that. So yeah, I think the other question I have was like, if you look at this, like this top move, it has a checkmate in 6, right? So I was curious, well, how strong, like if I play the move that I calculated, rook e5, the move that I expected black to make was probably queen f8. So if they played the strongest delay move that they could, that the computer thought up, it'd be a checkmate in 5, right? But if a human played this move, you'd see it's actually just as strong. Now the next strongest is checkmate in 4. So it actually turned out to be a pretty comparable line that I feel a human would be more likely to make. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this puzzle, and I hope that you were able to figure out maybe at least the beginning of the line. And if you weren't, don't worry. Keep following along and trying to study and solve these puzzles, and I promise that your calculation skills will rise along with my own. All right, until next time.